I'm Evan Feigenbaum, the Vice President for Asia at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And this is Six Crises, a multi-chapter video book that looks at how the United States and China have, in 6 instances and over nearly 20 years, managed to coordinate despite their deep-seated and intensifying strategic rivalry. In this series, we talk in detail to 6 senior American decision makers who led the coordination with Beijing on some of the toughest and indeed some of the scariest problems the world has faced over the last 2 decades. And the world is facing another such crisis today because of the global pandemic caused by the coronavirus, COVID-19. Now, because this virus has put so much of the world into lockdown, we've conducted these conversations by video, with these 6 Americans joining us from their living rooms, home libraries, and home offices. The title of the series, Six Crises, is borrowed from a book of the same name, a memoir published in 1962 by the then former Vice President of the United States, Richard Nixon. Nixon was out of public office then, having lost the 1960 presidential election to John F. Kennedy. But he decided to write a memoir because when reflecting on his own experiences, he concluded that individual choices and decisions had mattered a lot in the crisis situations that had shaped his career. And that's precisely why we've built this series of videos around the recollections of individuals. Like the 6 people we talked to in this series, Nixon had been a central figure in major events. But each of those situations had, as he put it in his memoir, far broader consequences, which completely overshadowed my personal fortunes. And that's obviously true of the 6 episodes that we examine here. The bigger the problem, Nixon wrote, the broader its consequences. And of course, Richard Nixon, who wrote that in 1962, would go on to be elected President of the United States. Now, by 1967, which was 2 years before he took office as president, Nixon had already developed some strong ideas about what the relationship between the United States and China might mean for the world or not. And remember that when Nixon ultimately made his famous visit to China in 1972, China was still crawling out of the mass hysteria of the Cultural Revolution, and Washington and Beijing were fighting a bitter proxy war in Vietnam. So Nixon surely had no illusions about 2 things. First, that the United States and China didn't share political systems, much less political ideologies. And second, that while both countries were in conflict with the Soviet Union, they didn't share too many security concepts either. And so not surprisingly, over the 48 years since then, Chinese communism and American constitutionalism have repeatedly clashed and collided. But Nixon did think this, that the nature of China's involvement with the world and the American relationship with China was going to matter a lot. Before he ran his victorious campaign for president, he wrote this in that now famous 1967 essay in Foreign Affairs magazine: "We simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, and threaten its neighbors." And so once he'd taken office as president, Nixon sought to open a relationship between communist China and the United States. But now we're in the year 2020, and all of that lies deep in the recesses of history. Today, both countries and the world are in a very different era. And to my mind, at least, the US-China relationship is more fraught than it has been in a generation. The strategic competition between the United States and China is deep. It is abiding, it is intensifying, and in many areas, especially those related to the security future of the Indo-Pacific region, it is now crystal clear that American and Chinese interests will clash, and they will clash often. But that has big implications for everybody else. And we are seeing some of those implications play out in the current pandemic of COVID-19. Here's why. The current US-China tensions raise tough questions for the rest of the world, not just about what China and the United States are doing, but perhaps more important about what they are not doing. Neither Washington nor Beijing is helping to organize and lead a collective global response to an acute health and economic crisis unseen since World War II. They are not mobilizing the Group of 20, nor international institutions, nor multinational health and financial instruments. And that leaves too many other countries to fend for themselves against the dreadful predations of this virus. So yes, strategic competition may now be giving way even to a kind of managed enmity. But strategic competition in itself isn't new at all. It's been a feature, not a bug, of the US-China relationship since its very inception during the 1972 Nixon visit. And yet for a variety of reasons, and in ways that we explore in depth in this series of videos, the United States and China have somehow managed to coordinate when major crises have threatened the world during the last 20 years. Now, the fact that those prior episodes of coordination are not being replicated today is the result of several dynamics. First, the personalities, pugnacious inclinations, and domestic political imperatives of the two leaders who currently manage both countries, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. Second, the way that both bureaucracies have come to view nearly every challenge through the lens of their security competition. Third, early actions in China during this pandemic to muzzle whistleblowers and suppress the dissemination of virus-related information. Fourth, American rhetoric about the pandemic, most notably from Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, who argued on television that the initial outbreak in Wuhan, China, offered an opportunity for the United States to capitalize economically on China's predicament. And not surprisingly, that raised hackles in Beijing. Fifth, Beijing's outrageous propaganda campaign to try shifting blame onto foreigners, including the United States and Italy. Sixth, an escalating war of words between Chinese and American officials over responsibility and culpability. And finally, the tendency in both Beijing and Washington to forget their own productive history of past coordination and its benefits to their citizens. But of course, the net result of all this is that security competition is bleeding back into literally every area of US-China interaction, from economic exchange to scientific research and even infectious disease prevention, mitigation, and cures. So that is why we've done this project. Because the fact is, over the last 20 years, these two countries did coordinate, did act in complementary ways, and did help to lead global responses to global threats. And that coordination happened despite their strategic tension. Now, in this series, we're going to explore 6 such crises with 6 former top American decision makers. 4 of them are former cabinet members. 1 is a former White House chief of staff, and 1 is a former US ambassador. And they include both Republicans and Democrats. Chapter 1 takes place in 2002. 3 diseases, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, were still wreaking havoc across much of the world. Ambassador Jack Chow was the top US global health diplomat at the State Department. And among other things, he helped spearhead the negotiations to establish and finance a global fund, a financial and programmatic partnership among dozens of governments to fight these 3 dread diseases. And he managed many of the tough negotiations around the global fund between the United States and China too. And importantly, these discussions began in 2001, which was the very same year that a major security crisis erupted between the two countries over a collision in the South China Sea between a Chinese fighter jet and an American EP-3 aircraft. Chapter 2 takes place a year later in 2003, when an earlier viral respiratory illness, severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, broke out in China, and then also spread across Asia and into North America. And that may sound eerily familiar to all of us now as we cope with the current pandemic that's been caused by another form of a coronavirus. Tommy Thompson, the stalwart former 4-term Republican governor of Wisconsin, was serving as the Secretary of Health and Human Services in the George W. Bush administration. He walked point for the United States with top health officials and policymakers in Beijing throughout this period of the SARS outbreak. Building on his efforts, the two countries subsequently set up a suite of biomedical training and joint surveillance activities for combating infectious diseases. Chapter 3 brings us to 2008, when the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression erupted, threatening global contagion and potentially economic collapse across the world. Hank Paulson, the 74th Secretary of the Treasury, presided over the American response to that crisis, including the establishment of the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. But he also managed all aspects of American coordination with China, aimed at forestalling contagion, stabilizing the markets, and establishing the Group of 20 Major Economies, or G20. Chapter 4 also takes place in 2008, this time around a crisis that erupted over the safety of food products that China exported to the United States. Mike Leavitt, the former two-term Republican governor of Utah, had succeeded Tommy Thompson as Secretary of Health and Human Services in President Bush's second term. In the face of that crisis, he negotiated an array of agreements and measures with China, including the opening of Food and Drug Administration offices in Chinese cities, and he managed to win agreement to pre-position American inspectors at Chinese transportation hubs. Chapter 5 moves us into the Obama administration. In 2013, John Podesta, the former White House Chief of Staff to President Bill Clinton, presided over a think tank that influenced the administration's thinking, including on environmental policy. The Montreal Protocol, established in 1987, had aimed to curtail the use of chemicals that deplete stratospheric ozone, but it didn't address hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, which are much more potent than carbon dioxide. In 2013, the same year that China unilaterally announced a controversial air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, which was viewed as a high-level security provocation in Washington, Presidents Obama and Xi agreed to wind down the production of HFCs. And they agreed to work together to persuade third countries like Brazil and India to join them. Podesta shaped those discussions from the outside, and then he joined the administration as counselor to the president, continuing to work on climate issues with China. Chapter 6, on the last of our 6 crises, takes place in 2014. Susan Rice was the National Security Advisor to President Obama when an outbreak of deadly Ebola cropped up in West Africa and began to ravage 3 countries, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Ebola is so deadly that it's had a death rate as high as 90% in some past outbreaks. And with Rice as the administration's point person, the United States and China agreed to complementary steps aimed not just at forestalling contagion from West Africa, but also at working together in the so-called hot zone, with team members from both countries working alongside each other at a Chinese laboratory established in Sierra Leone. These prior episodes hold a lot of lessons for us today. After all, the 2 countries that have led the globalization of the world economy for the past 25 years are now failing utterly to foster collective action during the global health crisis set off by the new coronavirus. Instead, they're racing to the bottom, with both governments refracting the outbreak through the prism of their geopolitical competition while hurling insults about each other's competence and intent. So it's worth reflecting for a moment on what's happened here. Now, as I said at the outset, the United States and China have always had ideological, political, and security tensions. But once they began to exchange goods, capital, people, and technology on a large scale in the 1990s, each country shelved at least some of its political and security concerns about the other. In effect, they consented to let forces of economic integration work their will. And as a result, many people came to presume that economic integration would mitigate security competition. But to put it pretty bluntly, that just hasn't happened. In fact, if anything, military tensions and competitive security dynamics are actually intensifying. And we can see this from the South China Sea to the Taiwan Strait. And what's more, now those security dynamics are actually bleeding back into trade, investment, educational exchanges, scientific research, frankly, pretty much everything that the United States and China either do or could do together. And so that means that the things that were supposed to integrate the 2 countries Those big flows of goods, capital, people, and technology that I mentioned are actually being refracted back through the prism of divergent security interests. And this dynamic has become worse in recent years, intensifying in particular in the years since Xi Jinping came to power in China in 2012. Chinese foreign policies have become more pugnacious and assertive, Chinese domestic policies more statist, and China itself considerably less open than in the prior decade. But amid all that, the central lesson of these 6 crises over the past 20 years is that crisis coordination can and should be possible, even when the two countries don't get along. Sadly, however, both China and the United States have forgotten a good deal of that shared history. So here are some threads that run through all 6 chapters of this series and all 6 of the crises we dig into. First, countries don't need to be friends to get meaningful things done. When the United States and China coordinated in these 6 crises, altruism had nothing to do with it. Beijing and Washington coordinated for self-interested reasons, not because they were in love, not because they shared deep ties of affection, not even because either of them was much interested in providing global public goods through any sort of joint effort. As Hank Paulson puts it when he talks in chapter 3 about the 2008 financial crisis, the things that China helped him to get done were also the things that China wanted to see done. And the things he tried to convince Beijing to do that were more about American desires than Chinese interests, well, coordination tended not to happen there. Now, second, that means that the United States and China don't need common interests to get things done either, just complementary ones. And let's face it, if these two countries don't have a complementary interest in halting the worst global pandemic in over 100 years and stopping it from wreaking havoc on the world economy, well, then where else could they possibly have complementary goals? Third, US-China geopolitical competition is real. It's very real, and nobody can simply wish that away. Working together on things like Ebola or HFCs or food safety, it's not necessarily a platform to fix the hardest things between the United States and China. But those instances have demonstrated what's possible when interests do coincide. And frankly, that matters for Americans, for Chinese, and for everybody else. It would not have been easier to stop Ebola if these two countries had instead been working to obstruct one another. It would not have forestalled financial contagion if these two countries hadn't taken some complementary steps. So that brings us to a fourth and final lesson from these chapters. Bluntly put, coordination is really, really hard. Governments, regimes, leaders, they don't act against their self-defined interest. The financial crisis provides a great example because before he was Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson had worked closely with Chinese leaders for decades, including as the chairman and chief executive of Goldman Sachs. But even he couldn't get the Chinese to do some things during the 2008 crisis. So at the end of the day, American and Chinese actions are dictated by American and Chinese interests. And it requires incredibly hard work by people with vision, persistence, and a sense of the moment to get from here to there. There is no magic wand to wave. There is no magic potion to induce altruistic joint action. But it is hard to solve real problems that affect real people the world over when the two most significant actors in the international system not only aren't coordinating, but are actually working at cross purposes, even if they're doing so for their own purposes. So the question facing the international system is whether and how the countries, governments, and peoples affected by what happens between Beijing and Washington can get those two to coordinate on things that really matter to the entire world. Or to put that a little bit differently, what is the rest of the world to do if no crisis is truly big enough anymore to elicit even modest cooperation between Beijing and Washington? The world surely won't be better off. And the stories at the heart of this project on 6 crises demonstrate how it can sometimes be made better. Now, my own view, quite frankly, is that this pandemic may have led us to a point where only third parties can change this debilitating dynamic in the immediate crisis. A multinational effort by other countries that leaves China, the United States, or both of them as the spoiler of meaningful collective action is perhaps the only immediate way to arrest this downward spiral, at least with respect to public health and economic mitigation in the current crisis. But beyond the current crisis, something else might possibly help. A richer understanding of the history that too many people on both sides have forgotten. That's why we've done this video project. So welcome to Six Crises, how the United States and China coordinated despite strategic rivalry. I hope you enjoy the 6 chapters, and I hope you'll also visit our other work in the Carnegie Endowment's diverse and distinctive programs on Asia.